So let's start with Mr. Finn, our first mic for the day. It has been only 2 years since the last UK nationwide poll won by Theresa May's predecessor David Cameron, and now this time certainly the general election has backfired for Theresa May herself. So how will this impact the future negotiations, which was originally the aim of the Brexit negotiation, of this general election rather?
Well, I think the impact of the general election on the Brexit negotiations, it will change the character potentially of what is being discussed. You know, Theresa May spoke outside Downing Street within the last hour or so. She claimed that, you know, things wouldn't change, that the same hard Brexit that she was pursuing, the same mandate will be there. In reality, that's just delusional. Realistically, if she's pursuing an arrangement with the Democratic Unionist Party, then the nature of the Brexit that she's pursuing will have to change. And also, I think most analysts in this country would probably come to the view that we can't really see this informal arrangement with the DUP lasting for any great length of time. She is incredibly weaker today than she was the day before yesterday, imponderably so. And as a consequence of that, in relation to the Brexit negotiations, it's really difficult to see a unified viewpoint from the UK. It's not even clear this government will last that long into the Brexit negotiations. So it really is all up in the air at the moment.
Let's talk to our another Mike, Mr. Mike Bastin there. Our Mr. Finn said earlier that the support for Theresa May is certainly very weak now, but how big is the possibility that she will be forced out of her office? She earlier said she declined to resign. So your point of view on this?
Oh, it's absolutely inevitable. It's only a matter of time, and I'm sure she's realised that the game's up. That in effect her political career has come to an end. The only issue is whether or not one of the likely contenders, obviously Boris Johnson's name springs to mind, is willing to jump into the fray at this moment in time under these circumstances, and the answer to that is probably not. So she probably will be forced to soldier on, but even that's uncertain. That could be days, could be weeks. It could run into late summer, early autumn, I suspect, when then she will, let's just say, be removed, I think, quite effectively from office, and there'll be a leadership challenge. I mean, she is fatally wounded. This is a spectacular own goal for her, and her career is over. Going into the Brexit negotiations, this could not be more uncertain. It couldn't be a worse outcome. It just was not possible. Business leaders have reacted very, very skeptically, and there's huge uncertainty over the UK now.
Right, business leaders in the market have been reacting to this very seriously. The pound has been plummeting when the news just come in. So tell us, it has also been said that given the surprise outcome of the poll, the pound could have been expected to fall even more sharply. Today it fell about 2%, which is a big move for currency. So the fact that it has not slipped further, May, does that reflect the diminishing prospect of a hard Brexit and that a softer version of Brexit is now more likely?
Yes, I think that's inevitable. I mean, Theresa May is a Remainer herself, so I think she's probably far more comfortable with a softer Brexit, and she called the election to actually try to nullify the threat from the Brexiteers, the hard Eurosceptics, in her party with a larger majority. She hasn't got that. She will now seek support from the Democratic Unionist Party, who will themselves be in favour of a softer Brexit, and she will probably have to somehow enlist the support of some of the other parties as well, I suspect. So certainly a softer Brexit is on the cards, but even that is very, very unclear. We're not really going to get a better picture until a few days, probably a week later, and probably after the first round of negotiations or those first meetings have taken place in 10 days' time.
Mr. Finn, you earlier said that the coalition between the Conservatives and the DUP may be weak. So do the two parties have many areas of disagreement? Why do you say that they're a weak coalition?
Well, I think they're a weak coalition for two reasons. I think purely arithmetically, just looking at the numbers, it's not going to give May a particularly strong, it's not going to give her a majority as such because it's an informal arrangement. But even if we consider it to effectively be a majority, which is what it'll be, it'll only be a very small one. And what that means in practice is that any kind of controversial legislation where there might be a rebellion from her own backbenchers, and that could be on Brexit, albeit that's probably not a legislative question at this point, but it could be other issues on the Tory programme, for example, like grammar schools. She's simply not going to be able to press ahead with those things, and that weakens her hand significantly. In addition to that, she made great play during the election campaign of the danger of voting Labour because of what she called a coalition of chaos, that Labour would do some deal with the SNP and that would put the future of the UK at stake. What she's effectively done, as the former Chancellor George Osborne has pointed out this morning, is she's effectively gone to the DUP in Northern Ireland and offered the same sort of setup that, you know, potentially could have been on the cards with Labour and the SNP. So in many ways, rhetorically, this coalition, this informal arrangement does not stack up. It's going to be open season on her in terms of the media, in terms of a resurgent Labour Party opposing her. And for that reason, I think, you know, and also it's an informal agreement that it seems at the moment, we're still learning about this, has very much been cooked up in number 10 amongst her tight coterie. Now, if that's the case, it's very hard to see the Tory party. I agree with my colleague who's speaking before. It's very hard to see the Tory party putting up with this for an extended period of time. And I think they're the biggest threat to Theresa May, not the forces outside, powerful as they may be.
Mr. Finn, let's say if this coalition fail or the opposition call or putting on a table a no confidence motion, how likely is this scenario?
I think it's entirely possible. I mean, I think the issue is this coalition, this informal arrangement, we should really say, confidence supply or whatever they're going to call it. This is so tenuous and tentative. There's so many divides and political tensions within it. There's so much ambiguity that at any point the opposition could table a no confidence motion. And for that, I mean, you've talked about the markets. You know, that is going to create a sort of persistent sense of uncertainty. And I think, you know, there'll be many people in the Conservative Party who'll look at the statement this afternoon. They will think that it was delusional, and they will want to hold Theresa May to account for this disastrous performance. And they will feel that she's tried to forestall that. So I think, yeah, absolutely a no confidence motion is a possibility. The question is, as my colleague said, just about timing. The question is, when is she going to go, not if.
Right. The market is, of course, waiting on further information or further news unfolding in this unprecedented political incidents now. So let me turn to Mr. Bastin there. You said earlier that, of course, the negotiations, everyone is now waiting for further news in the coming days or even weeks, but the Brexit negotiation is happening in 10 days. How will the negotiations now carried on? Will it be carried on in the same way as it had originally been planned?
Well, I think that the timetable, I mean, Jean-Claude Juncker has publicly declared today that the timetable really needs to start before there can be any discussion about extensions or modifications. So I think that on the EU side, they'll be very, very keen to instigate the process. How things unfold after that, again, is very, very unclear and very, very difficult to predict. I suspect it depends on how effectively this wounded Conservative Party and fatally wounded Conservative leader can somehow put together some sort of apparently coordinated, well-thought-through approach just to see how the negotiations go. But I think a lot of people seem to be making the assumption that there's a lot to negotiate. If you look, you step back and you look at this, the EU are going to be very, very firm with the UK and simply say to them, you chose to leave, these are the rules. This is the position, and then the UK are going to have the government, whatever the government is and whatever their stance is, they're going to have very, very little room and very, very little power to negotiate.
Though we say this is the consequences. I want to talk a little bit about the Scottish National Party. It has won more seats than all the other parties combined after making stunning gains in 2015. It lost seats to the Conservatives, Labour, as well as the Lib Dems. The SNP has argued strongly not for the Scottish independence, but also for Scotland to remain in the EU. So, Mr. Finn, does this vote add to the likelihood of the UK's eventually being torn apart?
Well, I think the SNP got a bloody nose last night. I think the Scottish Conservatives ran a good campaign around issues around the union and around a rejection of a second independence referendum. Obviously, Labour took seats off the SNP as well last night. So I think I wouldn't go quite so far as to say the SNP is over or finished. That'd be far from the truth. Obviously, they're still enormously powerful in Scotland. But I would say that a lot of the momentum that the SNP have had, certainly since 2007, waned last night. And I think it's far from clear that that's, I mean, if you'd asked me 6 months ago, I would have said at some point, inevitably, there will be a second independence referendum. I'm far from clear on that now. I think that potentially the momentum for that has ebbed away a little bit, and we'll have to see how that pans out. I don't think Sturgeon is fatally wounded by any means at all, but I do think that the SNP has got to have a serious rethink in terms of how it actually operates, because in some ways what's happened in Scotland is both a comment on independence, on the second referendum potential, but it's also a comment on the SNP in government, and that is a reasonably chastening comment that they've received in the course of the last 24 hours. So I would suspect that the prospect of an independence referendum has receded slightly. It's not off the table, of course, certainly not whilst they have the power they have at Holyrood, but I think it's receded slightly, and it'll be interesting to see what Sturgeon's approach is after the reverses she suffered last night.
Thank you very much. So is Mr. Mike Finn, Deputy Head at the School for Cross-Faculty Studies at Warwick University, and on the phone, Mr. Mike Bastin, Senior Lecturer, Southampton University. Thank you very much. Well, just as former UK Prime Minister David Cameron finished off his own career by gambling with an EU referendum he didn't have to have, Theresa May followed him by calling a national vote when it was not required, and could well find that her career might end in a similar way. What many politicians are finding out is that young people are now standing up to be counted. Indeed, it has been said that it was the youth vote that swung this election away from the ruling Conservatives. No doubt analysts will be poring over the voting figures for quite a while to come, but what is certain is that we live at a time when nothing can be taken for granted anymore. Social media, among many other things, disseminated news and opinion in a way that nothing else has ever managed to achieve previously. As Theresa May has now come to realize, there is a lot of truth in that old saying, act in haste, repent at leisure.